When you set these boundaries, avoidance fall for you sounds backwards at first because most people think love is won through more effort, more reassurance, more availability, more patience, more understanding. But the strange thing about avoidance is that the harder you try to hold on to them emotionally, the faster they start slipping through your fingers. And some of you already know exactly what that feels like. One day they are warm, attentive, affectionate, texting constantly, making you feel chosen in a way that almost feels unreal. And then suddenly it changes. Their replies slow down, their energy shifts, they become harder to reach emotionally. You start wondering what you did wrong, replaying conversations in your head at 2 a.m., trying to decode tiny changes in tone like your entire emotional stability depends on it. But here is the part nobody tells you. Avoidants are not usually running away from love itself. They are running from the feeling of losing themselves inside someone else's emotional expectations. The moment a relationship starts feeling emotionally heavy, emotionally demanding, or psychologically consuming, their nervous system quietly starts searching for escape routes. And ironically, the people who make avoidance feel safest are often the people who know how to stay emotionally grounded without chasing, the people who can love deeply without abandoning themselves, the people who understand boundaries. That is why in this video we are going to unpack the specific boundaries that completely change how avoidants see you, because some boundaries don't push avoidance away, they actually make avoidance fall harder than they expected. And if you've ever felt emotionally exhausted trying to understand someone who keeps pulling close and then disappearing, subscribe to the channel right now, because this channel is basically decoding the emotional patterns most people spend years suffering through without ever fully understanding. One of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is assuming that more effort automatically creates more closeness. So when the avoidant starts pulling away, they double their energy, they send longer messages, they try harder conversations, they over-explain their feelings. They ask for reassurance repeatedly, they become hyper-available emotionally because they think consistency will finally make the avoidant feel safe enough to stay. But what actually happens is something painfully confusing. The avoidant begins feeling emotionally crowded. Not because your feelings are wrong, not because your needs are toxic, but because avoidants often associate closeness with pressure instead of comfort. Deep down, many of them learned that relationships slowly erase freedom, autonomy, and emotional control. So the more emotionally pursued they feel, the more their nervous system starts interpreting the relationship as something they need distance from in order to breathe again. This is why chasing almost always backfires with avoidance. The constant checking in, the emotional monitoring, the need for certainty every day, it unintentionally confirms their deepest fear that relationships eventually become emotionally consuming. And what makes this dynamic even more painful is that the person chasing usually thinks they are fighting for love, while the avoidant experiences it as emotional suffocation. That is why boundaries matter so much here. Boundaries interrupt the cycle. Boundaries create space where panic used to exist. Boundaries communicate something incredibly powerful to avoidance without even saying it directly. I care about you, but I will not lose myself trying to keep you. And for avoidance, that energy feels unfamiliar in the most magnetic way possible. One boundary changes almost everything with avoidance, and it is the boundary of stopping the emotional over-pursuit. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean pretending not to care. It means refusing to chase someone who keeps emotionally retreating while expecting you to do all the emotional labor. Avoidants are deeply used to people pursuing them after they pull away. They are used to emotional panic following their distance. They expect the long paragraphs, the desperate attempts to reconnect, the emotional bargaining. So when someone responds differently, when someone remains calm, grounded, and emotionally self-respecting, it completely changes the emotional atmosphere. Suddenly, the avoidant cannot predict the dynamic anymore. Suddenly, there is space. Suddenly, there is silence where reassurance seeking used to exist, and that silence becomes loud in their mind. Because when you stop emotionally over-pursuing an avoidant, they are finally left alone with their own feelings instead of constantly reacting to yours. That is when many avoidants start becoming emotionally curious again. That is when they start wondering why your energy feels different. And this is important. Healthy boundaries are not emotional games. They are not manipulation tactics designed to win someone back. Real boundaries come from emotional stability, not strategy. They come from finally understanding that love should not require abandoning your dignity every single day. The moment you stop chasing someone's attention like survival depends on it, your entire emotional presence changes. You stop radiating desperation. You stop orbiting around their moods. And avoidants notice that shift immediately, even when they pretend not to. What many people do not realize is that avoidants secretly respect people who respect themselves, more than words, more than affection, more than emotional intensity. Avoidants are often drawn toward people who feel emotionally whole on their own. People who have structure, purpose, discipline, routines, passions, and identities outside the relationship. Because deep down, avoidants fear relationships where they become somebody's entire emotional world. That pressure terrifies them. But when they meet someone who values themselves enough to maintain boundaries, something changes psychologically. The relationship stops feeling like emotional captivity and starts feeling emotionally safe. Think about it. When someone instantly drops their standards, sacrifices their routines, ignores disrespect, tolerates inconsistency, and emotionally overinvests too quickly, the avoidant subconsciously feels the weight of that attachment growing heavier and heavier. But when someone maintains balance, when someone can say no calmly, when someone does not tolerate mixed signals forever, when someone keeps living their own life fully, the avoidant often becomes more emotionally drawn in because the relationship no longer feels like a trap closing around them. And this is where many viewers finally start understanding why boundaries are not walls. Boundaries are emotional clarity. They tell people, this is how I love without abandoning myself. That energy creates attraction because it creates respect. And without respect, avoidants almost never stay emotionally invested for long. One of the strongest boundaries you can ever set with an avoidant is refusing to beg for communication. This one changes the dynamic faster than almost anything else, because avoidants often unconsciously expect emotional pursuit after withdrawal. They pull away, become distant, disappear emotionally for a while, and somewhere deep down they expect the other person to come running after them, demanding reassurance and connection. But when you stop begging for communication, something psychologically powerful happens. You stop feeding the cycle. Instead of flooding them with emotional energy, you calmly observe their actions. You stop trying to force closeness that they are resisting. You stop acting like basic communication is something you need to earn. And that quiet self-respect creates emotional consequences avoidants actually feel, because suddenly they are no longer managing your emotional reactions, they are sitting alone with the absence of your pursuit. And for many avoidants, that is deeply unsettling. Not because they stopped caring, but because they are used to relationships where the other person carries all the emotional intensity for them. The moment that energy disappears, they are forced to confront their own attachment instead of constantly escaping into emotional distance. And this is where avoidants often begin falling harder than they expected, because boundaries create the one thing avoidants secretly crave most in relationships: emotional safety without emotional control. And the strange part is, avoidants often do not even fully understand why this affects them so deeply. On the surface, they may still look calm, detached, or emotionally controlled, but internally something shifts when they realize you are no longer emotionally collapsing every time they create distance. Because many avoidants are accustomed to relationships where silence creates panic. They are used to seeing people spiral emotionally the moment they withdraw. So when you stop reacting dramatically to their distance, when you stop chasing explanations, when you stop trying to emotionally force clarity out of someone who keeps pulling away, it quietly disrupts the emotional script they are familiar with. Suddenly they are no longer in control of the emotional rhythm of the relationship. Suddenly your calmness becomes impossible to ignore. And this is where a lot of people misunderstand emotional detachment. Calm detachment is not coldness, it is emotional maturity. It is the ability to stay connected to yourself even when someone else becomes inconsistent. Because the truth is, avoidants often expect emotional chaos after creating distance. They expect anger, desperation, guilt-tripping, emotional pressure. But when you remain emotionally steady instead, it creates something they rarely experience in relationships: safety without emotional volatility. And deep down, avoidants crave that more than they know how to admit. Many of them grew up around emotional unpredictability. Love may have felt conditional, invasive, overwhelming, or emotionally confusing, so when they encounter someone who does not react impulsively every time fear enters the relationship, their nervous system slowly begins lowering its defenses. That is why your ability to stay emotionally grounded during distance becomes incredibly attractive to an avoidant. It signals strength, it signals self-worth, and most importantly, it signals that loving you does not automatically mean drowning inside emotional chaos. This is also why keeping your own life is one of the most powerful boundaries you can ever set. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to relationships where one person slowly begins orbiting entirely around them emotionally. The moment they feel like someone's happiness, identity, and emotional stability fully depend on the relationship, they often start feeling trapped without even understanding why. And honestly, this is where so many people unintentionally lose themselves. They stop prioritizing friendships. They abandon hobbies. Their routines disappear. Their goals fade into the background. Their entire emotional world slowly becomes centered around whether the avoidant feels close or distant that day. And at first, they think this proves love. But over time, it quietly destroys attraction because the relationship starts carrying the emotional weight of an entire identity. Avoidants do not fall deeply for people who emotionally disappear into them. They often fall for people who remain connected to themselves. People who continue building their life regardless of relationship uncertainty. People who still laugh with friends, chase goals, maintain routines, and protect their individuality even while loving deeply. Because that kind of person does not feel emotionally consuming, they feel emotionally free. And freedom matters enormously to avoidants. In fact, many avoidants only begin truly appreciating someone when they realize that person's life does not stop revolving just because the relationship becomes uncertain. There is something deeply magnetic about someone who can love fully while still remaining emotionally rooted in their own purpose. That balance creates intrigue, it creates respect, and ironically, it often creates the emotional safety avoidants need in order to move closer instead of farther away. The reason emotional stability feels so rare and powerful to avoidants is because many of them learn to associate intimacy with emotional exhaustion. Somewhere in their past, closeness stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling emotionally dangerous. Maybe vulnerability led to criticism. Maybe affection came with guilt. Maybe love felt intrusive instead of comforting. Maybe emotional needs always became overwhelming obligations they could never fully satisfy. So over time, they learned to survive relationships by controlling distance. They learned to regulate themselves through emotional space. That is why emotionally reactive relationships activate their defenses so quickly. The moment emotions become too intense, too chaotic, too consuming, their nervous system starts screaming for escape even if they genuinely care about the person. But boundaries completely change this dynamic because healthy boundaries reduce emotional unpredictability. Boundaries create consistency. Boundaries remove the hidden emotional pressure avoidants are constantly scanning for. When you communicate calmly instead of exploding, when you maintain self-respect instead of emotionally collapsing, when you give space without punishment, when your emotions do not swing wildly based on their temporary withdrawal, avoidants slowly start experiencing something unfamiliar, closeness that feels peaceful instead of dangerous. And for many avoidants, that experience is deeply disorienting because it challenges everything they subconsciously believe relationships eventually become. This is why emotionally stable people leave such lasting impressions on avoidants. Not because they are emotionally unavailable, but because they are emotionally regulated. There is a massive difference. Emotional stability says, I can love you without losing control of myself. And to someone terrified of emotional engulfment, that energy feels incredibly safe. Another boundary that changes everything is refusing to reward mixed signals. This one is huge because many avoidants unintentionally create relationships built on inconsistency. One day they are emotionally available, affectionate, vulnerable, and deeply connected. The next day they become distant, detached, confusing, or hard to reach emotionally. And unfortunately, many people respond to this inconsistency by investing even harder. They cling tighter during the cold periods, hoping to earn the warmth back again. Without realizing it, they begin rewarding emotional inconsistency with increased emotional access. And over time, this creates a painful cycle where the avoidant learns they can give minimal consistency while still receiving maximum emotional investment in return. But boundaries interrupt this cycle completely. The moment you stop rewarding confusion, the dynamic shifts. When someone gives mixed signals and you calmly step back instead of chasing harder, you send a powerful message without needing to argue or punish them emotionally. You communicate that emotional inconsistency has consequences. Not revenge, not manipulation, just consequences. Because emotionally healthy people do not endlessly invest into uncertainty, and this is where avoidants often begin feeling something unexpected. Respect mixed with fear of loss. Because many avoidants unconsciously assume the other person will always tolerate the inconsistency. They assume the emotional door will always remain open no matter how distant they become. But when boundaries appear, when access is no longer unconditional, they suddenly become aware that your emotional presence is valuable and not guaranteed forever. and that realization can trigger emotional clarity they never allowed themselves to feel before. There is also something incredibly powerful about learning how to say no. Most people think attraction grows through endless accommodation, endless understanding, endless sacrifice, but avoidants often lose attraction when relationships become emotionally one-sided. When someone always says yes, always overextends themselves, always accepts less than they deserve, the relationship slowly loses emotional tension and mutual respect. Healthy refusal creates individuality. It creates emotional structure. It reminds the avoidant that you are a whole person with boundaries, standards, and self-respect, not someone willing to abandon themselves just to keep the relationship alive. And avoidants are often far more drawn to that energy than people realize. Because deep down, avoidants do not actually want emotional captivity. They want connection that still allows freedom, individuality, and mutual respect to exist side by side. So when you calmly say no to disrespect, no to inconsistency, no to emotionally draining behavior, no to losing yourself in the relationship, something changes in how they perceive you. You stop feeling emotionally desperate, you stop feeling endlessly available, and instead you begin feeling emotionally valuable. Not because you became cold or unavailable, but because your love now carries self-respect inside it. And for avoidance, that combination can become unforgettable. But this is the point where a lot of people accidentally misunderstand boundaries completely. They think boundaries are supposed to punish the avoidant. They use silence as revenge, distance as manipulation, detachment as a performance designed to trigger pursuit. And while that may temporarily create reactions, it does not create real emotional safety. Avoidants are incredibly sensitive to hidden emotional control even when they cannot explain it logically. The moment boundaries become weapons instead of self-respect, the relationship slowly becomes another emotional battlefield they want to escape from. Real boundaries are not about controlling another person's behavior. They are about protecting your emotional well-being regardless of how another person behaves. That distinction changes everything. A true boundary says, I will not abandon myself trying to force connection. A manipulative boundary says, I am withdrawn.